Hello, friends, and welcome to the Handyman Success Podcast. Our mission is to teach and inspire by sharing the stories and insights of our guests. Whether you're a prospective, new, or seasoned handyman business owner, you will learn practical business tips you can apply today and be inspired that you can reach your goals and create a better tomorrow. I'm one of your hosts, Jason Call, owner of Handyman Marketing Pros. We equip small, family-owned handyman businesses with modern websites and SEO to help grow their businesses online. I'm joined by my co-host, Alan Lee, who has built his handyman business to a point where it runs without him. He now teaches others, step by step, how to do the same thing through his Handyman Journey business coaching. You can learn more about our marketing and coaching services by scheduling a call with us on handymansuccess.net. So whether you're patching drywall, sitting in the office, or making your third run to Home Depot, we invite you to pull up a chair and sit with us on another episode of the Handyman Success Podcast. Today we're joined by Chris Olson with Northwest Moss Removal, and this is our first revisit. So Chris was our third episode with his company Pacific Outdoor Living. So I'm super excited to have Chris back to talk about his experience over the last 3 years or so since we originally sat down with him. He's got quite a story for being a relatively pretty young dude. So Chris, thanks so much for joining us again today. If you don't mind, just give our audience just a little introduction of who you are, where you're located, your current business, and just kind of where you're at right now.
Yeah, absolutely, Jason. Thanks for having me again. Excited to be here. My name is Chris Olson. I live in the greater Seattle area of Washington State. Specifically, I'm based up in Snohomish County, which is just north of Seattle, about 45 minutes. My current business is I own an outdoor exterior cleaning company called NW Northwest Moss Removal. And despite the name, we do more than just remove moss. We are a complete exterior cleaning company. So roof cleaning, gutter cleaning, pressure washing, siding cleaning, house washes, soft washing, window cleaning, window washing, as well as minor repairs. So like we fix up gutters, replace damaged shingles, touch up chimneys, things like that. But I'm out of the true general contracting game and big construction jobs. So we're truly a service call company, similar to the size as far as like average ticket and average number of jobs per day or week is like a handyman company would be. I've got four employees in the field, technically five, one of them's part-time. And I've got myself and then a VA and my wife in the office. And we, how do I phrase it? We have been in such a crazy transition the last few years, especially the last year. But we are doing good. Northwest Moss Removal has been around for 25 years. I bought the company in 2021 while I was still running Pacific Outdoor Living, my general contracting company. And then when Pacific Outdoor Living closed down, I separated Northwest Moss and kept it as my only company and have been putting all my focus and attention there for the last 6 months to a year. It's been more or less the same size for that whole like 25 years. I worked for the previous owner in high school. Love the previous owners a lot. They're awesome people. They are now living on a golf course retirement community in Arizona and enjoying their senior years. But they really built the foundation of the company. We do advertise and market and all that kind of stuff, but our biggest client base is we have 15,000 clients in our client database from the last 20 years. So we do a lot of remarketing to existing clients and have a lot of annual contracts. So it's a very well established company, but I'm working on building it into a more systemized and scalable company I can grow from here.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So
Yeah.
3 years ago, we had you on here as Pacific Home Maintenance, right? Or Pacific Outdoor Living. Where did that company go? If you don't mind sharing a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the two different names, it's kind of funny. I believe I actually rebranded within a few months of being on your podcast last time, because when I started my company, it was Pacific Home Maintenance, and I started it as a handyman company. That's where I originally, I think I started networking with you, Alan, as I think I joined your Facebook group when I was very new, like my first 6 months, when it was just me running around in my F-150 with the tools I already had in my garage and mounting TVs and patching drywall for a couple of bucks here and there. And about a year to a year and a half into having that company, I had hired an employee or two. I had grown to having a pretty decent client base. And I was starting to take on bigger and bigger projects. And it's one of my favorite stories of that company that the first big project I landed, and by big, I mean over a few $1,000s, was actually a $17,000 deck remodel. That was from a client that originally the way I met them is they hired me off a Facebook post to mount their TV. So
Wow.
it's kind of
Amazing.
funny. Like you hear guys that run smaller handyman companies all the time talking about that transition from small jobs to big jobs. And I got my general contracting license originally because a dude that I got $200 from to mount a TV asked me if I could rebuild his deck. And I
Hmm.
didn't even barely know how to estimate. Looking back on it, it's kind of funny. That job would have been more like $30,000 if I knew how to estimate. I basically
Hmm.
broke even on it, but it was my first real general contracting job. And then I grew from there to a few years later. Flash forward to about 2022, early 2023. I had 15 employees, was doing about 2.8 million a year. Had an office, a shop, the whole shebang, kind of like everything that you're supposed to have, quote unquote. If you can't see that, I don't know if this is going to be video or audio only, but I'm doing the little quotation mark science with my hands because supposed to have is a relative term. I learned that lesson the hard way. But we had a massive overhead, a massive payroll. We were doing huge jobs. Our biggest job was $278,000. And that was a complete outdoor backyard remodel that spanned 4 or 5 thousand square feet, pavers, patios, decks, furniture, gazebos, outdoor kitchen, hot tub, pool deck. Like it was absolutely bonkers. And what happened was in the TLDR, like short abbreviated version, is that I grew way too fast without enough systems in place, leveraged too much debt, and found myself in a spot where I had to lay off half the company in order to keep the lights on. And then I spent
Hmm.
6 months to a year fighting to try and keep my head above water and ended up closing down the company because I knew that it wasn't sustainable. We didn't have good systems in place for estimating. I tried to put people without enough training and experience into roles to fill things like salesman, admin, and project management roles. I didn't have enough experience myself as an owner to see the writing on the wall before it was too late. And I ended up at the very end, all things said and done, I was $800,000 in debt between liabilities, between working capital, between vehicles, equipment. I mean, we had 5 trucks on the road. We had a Bobcat. We had dump trailers. We had equipment. We had working capital loans. We had lines of credit. We had all the things that you see in all these like high speed, fancy entrepreneur groups is a good idea. And
Hmm.
I told myself many times that you have to spend money to make money and that leveraging debt responsibly is fine. But I didn't know that at the end of the day, the writing on the wall should have been visible to me a lot earlier that I was underwater. And I laid off half the company to save on payroll and to save on overhead. I cut down all my expenses. I got rid of my shop. I sold a lot of equipment. And I actually, in the span of 30 days, cut my overhead from $78,000 a month to $20,000 a month. And
Wow.
my payroll from $30,000 a pay period to $14,000 a pay period, and even less than that actually because I stopped paying myself. And it's still, well, we lasted 6 more months. We thought we were going to crawl our way out of the hole. But then we got behind on payments and on debt ceiling because obviously when you have $800,000 in debt to service and you're cutting your revenue from $200,000 a month to $100,000 a month and you're factoring in
Hmm.
overhead and payroll, all of a sudden there's not enough money left at the end of the month to service the debt fast enough to keep your creditors happy. So I ended
Man.
up so underwater that after spending that 6 months to a year basically fighting to get back to breaking even, I had a sit down meeting with in the same week. I had a sit down meeting with a bankruptcy attorney, with my accountant, with my business coach, and with my bookkeeper and with my project manager. And all of them told me the same thing, which was that I was at a point where I had to make a decision to either close down and shut everything down or spend 5 to 7 years trying to claw my way back to where I started. Um, and I don't know if you, I don't, I'm probably rambling here at this point, but
You're good, man. Keep it
um,
going. This is
Great.
really,
yeah,
really
I,
appreciate you sharing this.
I basically got to a point where I had to make the decision to either declare bankruptcy or fight my way back to the surface for 5 to 7 years. And one of the hardest things about that was I had to learn that filing for bankruptcy is a tactical tool and is not failure. And a lot of people listening to this probably have had those feelings of, man, I can't make payroll next week. Man, I can't pay my bills next week. and have felt that pressure. But until you've been through a bankruptcy, it's hard to wrap your head around what it actually means. Because a lot of people use the term bankrupt as this term that's synonymous with failure or giving up or throwing in the towel. And it basically equates to losing everything and starting over and living in a cardboard box on the side of the road somewhere. I don't think people really realize that you can file for Chapter 13 bankruptcy and be back on your feet in a couple of years and still pay all your bills in those couple of years. You might not have credit. Your credit score is going to be terrible. But if you talk to almost every very successful person, almost all of them have been bankrupt at least once in their 20s or 30s. A business coach that I used to work with that currently owns a very large commercial remodeling company, doing like multiple 8-9 figures. I can't remember the exact number, but he went bankrupt twice, once in the 90s and once in 2008, and is now very successful. But as the old saying goes, the good lessons are expensive and the best lessons are really expensive. So,
man, that's awesome. And I think from this conversation, I think we can learn a heck of a lot of lessons. If you don't mind being our little guinea pig, this is going to be pretty interesting. Because I think a lot of people in the entrepreneur space, you like Jason puts it, there's this pressure of like the grind, like just keep grinding away and you will find success. And I think sometimes people, they get on the wrong side of that, right? They get too much debt to income, like too much debt to income ratio, too much payroll to income ratio, overhead. And so I would love to kind of dig into some of those so that maybe we could set up some red flags for people that are maybe going down that path and they don't even know it. Like, do you have, I mean, it's kind of a crazy question and it might be hard to quantify, but do you have, what's your take on debt coming out of this, being overwhelmed with debt? And what would you say is like a healthy debt to income ratio, if any? Like how would you do it if you did it again with debt specifically?
So what I would tell you is two things. I would say, one, I'm still a very firm believer that responsibly used and leveraged debt, if used appropriately, is absolutely necessary and good in business. However, what I learned is that what I defined as responsibly used and leveraged debt was not. So I'll give you an example. If you're starting a new company and you have no revenue and you take out a $50,000 loan to buy a new truck, it's probably not very responsible. I think everybody knows that. Everybody knows that you shouldn't be driving a $100,000 truck if you can't afford the $2,000 a month payment. On the business side of things, I think there's a big disconnection between using debt for things that directly make you money and using debt for things that you want and you can kind of quote unquote justify as being needed in your business. I'll give you a great example. In my old company, we bought a Bobcat. It's a $40,000 piece of equipment, but we bought it because over a period of about a year, we were paying $2,000 a month on average in rental fees to rent a Bobcat. That Bobcat, when I bought it, was on a 5-year term and the payment was $800 a month. So that means that every month that we're not renting that machine, we're actually saving $1,200 and we're building equity in a piece of machinery that we actually own instead of paying some rental company's overhead. That is a perfect example to me of something that is a good use of debt in a business. But if you're a fencing company that could just as easily buy a $500 gas-powered auger instead of a Bobcat to drill fence post holes, it's probably not a justifiable expense. Another good example is if you're a handyman who's brand new and you have a truck or a van that works, but you want to buy a brand new van because you want to look more professional for customers, you could argue that's a good use of money, but you could also argue that waiting a year or two until you have more money or until you've saved up enough to pay off half or all of that vehicle up front instead of going into debt over it would be a better decision. A good example in my company now is I have a credit line in my new company that somehow I still have, even though I'd filed for bankruptcy 6 months ago. But that credit line has been active for 6 months and I haven't touched it. The only reason I have it is so that if I ever ended up in a situation where I needed money emergently to pay payroll or to do something else in the company, I know that I wouldn't be out of business over something that could be resolved by borrowing a few $1,000s. That being said, people use credit lines for the craziest things. I mean, I knew a guy a couple of years ago who had $100,000 in working credit that he could borrow from whenever he wanted, and he would borrow from it and pay it off in the same week, basically every week, because he had to buy so much materials up front for jobs. But it took him a couple of years to have enough money saved up in the bank to actually be able to do that in cash. So that credit line allowed him to operate his business. Another great example is net 30 accounts. So if you're a guy that all you do is build decks like I used to, I used the heck out of my net 30 account at my lumber yard because I could file a contract for a $50,000 deck with $20,000 in materials, take a deposit for half of that project up front. That deposit would sit in the bank. I would buy those materials on credit, but I didn't actually owe the lumber yard that money until those materials were delivered to the job site. So during that 2 or 3 weeks that I had quote unquote paid for that lumber, if the customer canceled the project or something happened, I could return it. And then that money is still sitting in my account and it can be returned to the customer instead of having to jump through all these hoops of I got to return the materials. Then I have to get my cash back. Then I have to wait for processing. Then I can issue a refund. So you still have that money sitting in your account, but that lumber that you purchased is on credit instead of in cash, especially if it hasn't been delivered or hasn't actually been used yet. It just makes the financials of operating that kind of company a lot simpler. Or another example is in my current company, I have a net 30 account at our chemical supplier. It only racks up $300, $400, $500, $600, $700 a month. It gets paid off on the first of each month. But it means that instead of every one of my employees having to pay $20 here, $50 here on the company card, it's one bill per month. So instead of having 50 transactions on my accounting, there's one. And I know that we have the money in the bank to pay that off every month. But there's so many different kinds of debt and there's so many different uses of it that I feel like a lot of business owners get into trouble because they borrow money in the hopes of growing, expanding, or improving their company. And what they really do is just give themselves another payment each month. And it doesn't really move the needle. I think at the end of the day, you can summarize all of that with one litmus test, which is if the money you're borrowing, you can directly show that it makes you more money, then it might be a decision worth considering. Doesn't mean it's the right decision, but if buying a piece of equipment or buying materials or buying something with leveraged debt means that you directly use that thing to make more money and it's still responsible and you know that you're going to have the money to pay it back, then it might be worth considering. But at the end of the day, so much debt that people borrow is with this hope and idea that it's going to actually make the money and it really doesn't do anything. It just puts them in a hole.
Man, I think that's spot on.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Chris. That's a huge topic that we haven't really spent a lot of time with on people because it's typically as far as small family and handyman businesses, which is most we have on the show here. Don't need to leverage like big debt like a general contractor. Yeah. There's more opportunities, you could say, to get debt. Not saying they're good opportunities.
Yeah.
The biggest takeaways that I hear from that, man, is firstly is patience, really noodling on something, because debt, that's a big obligation that you take on. So being patient, being honest with, I love that brand new F-250. Like that would look great in our fleet. My truck's getting kind of old, but like you got to be honest. Like, is that actually going to make you any money?
Right.
Being honest with yourself. I think that there's a lot of equivalence between personal finance and business because, like in personal finance, you want to invest in appreciating assets, not depreciating. So like a brand new car, luxury goods, luxury clothes, etc. And there's so many equivalents in business that you can just put your money into, and it's just ultimately it's probably an ego stroke kind of thing. Not saying that's what you were doing, but the patience and honesty.
You can definitely accuse me of that because I have a $90,000 truck sitting in my driveway.
Yeah, well, but
at the time I bought it, I actually needed it. I kept it because I like it, but at the time I was towing 15,000 pounds 3 or 4 times a week.
Yeah,
so it made sense at the time. But I ironically, the only reason I still have that truck, actually, I make that joke, but I should probably tell the whole story. So I bought that truck 3 years ago when my business was doing really well and the payment was chump change. and I needed to tow heavier loads. I had driven an old beat up F-150 that had an EcoBoost in it that would tow 10, 12, 13,000 pounds. But I felt unsafe driving down the road like that because half-ton trucks are not designed to break those kind of loads, even if the rating says you can tow it. Fun fact.
Mhm.
And I bought that truck, and then 6 months later, I was in an accident, and the insurance company actually totaled it. But it only had minor body damage. It had about $8,000 worth of body damage. They actually wanted to scrap it. I bought it back from the scrap company for $5,000, and I fixed it myself. And now I have what is arguably still a $50,000 or $60,000 truck that I basically paid nothing for, because
Wow.
I'd only made 6 months worth of payments on it, and then the insurance company totaled it, wrote my bank a check, and paid off the loan.
Wow.
And I got to keep it for scrap costs. So I theoretically paid $15,000 for that $80,000 truck.
Nice.
That's a deal right
That's
there.
that's a cheat code. Just I don't recommend trying. I don't recommend trying it.
So okay, we talked about kind of relationship change with debt. What are some other kind of takeaways from your experience? Like what would you do differently? Like I'm sure like hiring labor, maybe
Yeah.
shop. Like if you don't mind just kind of digging up some
Yep.
more like takeaways from that experience.
Yeah. There's a couple of them. So I think another big one is I spent a lot of money trying to train people that weren't ready to be in the position they were in. A big part of the issue with my company was that I hired a salesman to do estimates and sales, who was a very good salesman but didn't understand estimating. And I spent 6 months to a year trying to help them understand estimating and to do accurate takeoffs. And they never really got the hang of it 100%. They were doing pretty well. They sold a lot of work, but a lot of the work they sold came in under budget or over budget or way off track. So that was hard. Um, they did a really good job at learning, and they tried really hard, but it was one of the many factors that led to like I didn't have enough direct supervision over them. I didn't set clear enough expectations for them. I didn't do a good enough job training them. And at the end of the day, I can put zero fault on that salesman for not succeeding better in their position. Same with my project manager. I took a guy that had worked for me for a couple of years, had been a really good foreman, and I put him into a project manager, operations manager role, primarily in the office. And he did a really good job with the level of experience and knowledge he had, but he had never been responsible for supervising large numbers of people. He had never been responsible for managing day to day projects. So he did as good of a job as he could, but once again, I didn't support him well enough. I didn't train him well enough. I didn't give him enough systems in place in order for him to succeed. So I can't be upset with him for not succeeding better in his role because I didn't set him up for success. Same, I had an office manager, same thing. I either micromanaged them or gave them too much freedom. I never found the sweet spot in the middle. I was either over their shoulder constantly, or I was say figure it out, and then I would leave the office. Like not literally but figuratively. And I
Mhm.
never really got the hang of getting them in just the right amount of training, just the right amount of procedures and policies and operations to get them really where they needed to be. Um, as far as all those go, like the biggest lessons that I learned from all of that was just the classic hire slow, fire fast. I won't get into that because I don't want to disparage anybody, but let me put it. Let me put it this way: I had multiple employees, field employees, who I employed for 6 months to a year that shouldn't have gotten more than a week. And
Hmm.
I wasn't aware enough to realize that. Um,
Yep.
there was donuts done in a Home Depot parking lot in a logoed company truck. There was drinking while on the job. There was leaving the job for hours at a time but staying on the clock. There was many issues like that that I didn't catch because I didn't have the systems in place to review people and catch those kind of things happening. I actually did the math once, and I probably lost 75 to $100,000 over employees not being managed well, if not a lot
Wow.
more. So that's a whole different can of worms that could almost be an episode by itself. But
Mhm.
um, having appropriate systems in place for employees to succeed on all those different levels is so important. So one of the biggest things I've done in my new company is I have very detailed employee handbooks, policies, procedures, standard operating guidelines, standard operating procedures, expectations, and the employees are trained well on all those things. So if an employee is not succeeding, I can directly point at, hey, you're not doing this. It's in this policy. You didn't follow this procedure. Here's your written warning. don't do that again. Or here's what you need to succeed because obviously I didn't give you enough information, or this wasn't communicated well enough to you, or I dropped the ball somewhere. And we can improve our efficiency in the field by making sure that people are closely managed and monitored in everything they do.
Man, that's awesome. That's awesome. So what would you say about, I can definitely relate to having people in the field that should not be working for you. Because like it's, on paper, that looks like an easy thing to do is hire slow, fire fast. It sounds like it's super easy, but it's a
You'd think
lot
so.
harder. It's a lot harder when you actually get to it because you're actually dealing
Yeah.
with real people.
Mhm.
And for me, like codependency takes over big time where you want to please everyone. You don't want to ruffle any feathers, but at the end of the day, you got to do what's right for your business and for your
Yeah.
family. So as far as like, you also said payroll was an issue. Was it just you had the wrong people on payroll, or did you have too many people doing the wrong things? Like, so I guess my question
All of
here
the
is
above.
similar to the last one of like, what's a good payroll to income ratio? And like, how do you manage that while trying to grow a business and you're trying to like fit people in the right places? Like, how do you do that?
Yeah, so I think it's hard to rationalize or put a number on a payroll to income ratio because I would argue that it's extremely industry and business dependent. I mean,
Mhm.
obviously, payroll to income ratio for a GC or a handyman or a pressure washing company or a window cleaning company or anything else is going to be different. But what I would say overall is that you have to know your numbers on such a deep level that you know that the amount of employees you have, amount of payroll you have, amount of overhead you have, amount of profit that you want is all included in your daily expected revenue and your daily actual revenue.
Mm,
So to break it down, I can give you an example of my roof and gutter cleaning company.
that'd be
Let
great.
me let me do something really quick. I'm gonna
Okay.
pull this up. I'll talk while I find this, but I I have an extremely detailed budget of my roof cleaning company. I know every single thing as far as the number of leads needed to get the number of jobs closed, to get the number of sales, to get the amount of revenue, to get the amount of profit that I want every week or month per employee, per crew, and for the whole company. So to give you an example, I have a spreadsheet open in front of me. I have every single overhead item listed, ranging from the big items all the way down to $10 a month for my GoDaddy domain registration amount. And I have a
Mm,
million things that are ranging from 5, 10, 15, $20 all the way up to my chemical cost of $2,000 or $3,000 a month. So I know that my overhead currently right now is $10,144 a month, including a couple of things that are projected to be spent but don't actually get spent every month. As an example, that includes spending $1,500 a month on paid ads. I don't do that almost ever. I'm usually way lower than that. But it has all the things like that. And then I have a separate overhead column to the right that has future projected overhead with growth, meaning what I expect to pay when I add or build the company bigger.
hmm,
Then I can go to the next one and I have my payroll calculations, which is average amount of pay per employee per hour and per day and per week and per month. And that's based on all my current employees. And then I actually have to the column to the right, I have my actual payroll data from the last 6 months. So I can look at what my projected cost per hour is versus what my actual cost per hour is. So I know that across my entire company, my estimated cost per employee per hour is $40. That's including payroll taxes, federal taxes, workers' compensation, benefits, everything. The only thing that doesn't include benefits wise is medical, vision, dental, and future retirement, if we ever do that again, are in my overhead for the whole company. But this includes stuff like workers' compensation, taxes, everything else. So my highest paid employee makes $42 an hour. My lowest paid employee makes $23 to $25 an hour. But the
mhm.
average across all of them with burden included is $40 an hour. And then I can go to my job cost calculations and use all the data from those first two things. So I have my overhead calculations, I have my payroll calculations. Then I go to my job cost calculations. I know that my average ticket of $735 for a half day job includes all of these items. So I have the on site labor, the travel labor, total labor cost $296. One crew of overhead, which is that total overhead per month divided by the number of working days in the month divided by the number of employees is $218. If I have 2 crews running every day, it's 156. If I have 3 crews running every day, it's 135. Because obviously, the more crews I have, the more divisible that overhead amount is. But it
Right.
also adds overhead. If I add a 3rd crew, it adds a truck payment and it adds insurance and it adds additional overhead in those ways. But the majority of my overhead, that basic $5,000 to $7,000 most companies have to operate, like insurance, licensing, bonding, my internet bill for my office, like things like that. The more employees you have, the more spread out that gets. So my overhead cost goes from 218 all the way down to 135 per job with 3 crews instead of 1. So I know that my average ticket size is $735 before sales tax. And I know that the average cost is actually I don't have that item listed, but I know that my labor overhead subtracted from my average cost, I in theory should make $221 in net profit per job per crew with only 1 crew on the road. If I have 3 crews on the road, it goes up to $244 per crew. But by the day, it goes up drastically. So this is the funny thing about finances in business, where I know that my net profit is only $30 more per crew with 3 crews, but that equates out to per month with 1 crew, it's $6,600 in net profit. With 3 crews, it's $23,500 in net profit because you
Yeah.
have 3 crews doing that much, not just 1.
You know
And I
that
have I
you
have
know
all this
that
data in a spreadsheet.
you guys know that gif where it's like what is it, the Milanaki, or that actor with the crazy fro, and he's just staring and like there's the numbers and like things. Like, that's what I feel like right now. And I feel like that's Chris every day. So I'm gathering, Chris, that like a huge takeaway is that like you are proactive with your expenses. You're
Mhm.
proactive with your what you can expect to be in the bank.
Yeah.
I think it's really sharp. And I actually do the same thing where I track all our expenses down to like if we had something that we paid $5 for, we put it
Yeah.
in like a one-time expenses. We got a regular and we track that
Yeah.
internally. But at the end of the day, the profit, the P&L, the profit and loss, that is the scorecard, right? And
Yeah.
so have that internal tracking, and then you have your profit and loss. You want to align those as closely as possible. So when you're doing that, you're inherently going through an exercise of understanding your numbers, understanding your expenses, and so that there's no surprises at the end of the month when payroll's coming up, or you got to pay this and that, credit card bills that you've been proactively tracking throughout the month, throughout the quarter, throughout the year, like the numbers of your business. And so as far as like Pacific Outdoor Living, were you doing any of that, or some of it, or just not paying attention?
Both. So I I did a lot of tracking myself, but the main really kind of big problem is that I got so big that I hired an accountant and a bookkeeper and I started doing everything with them and I wasn't directly involved in a lot of it. And I didn't really realize that the level of attention that my bookkeeper and accountant gave to my books when they have 50 other clients obviously is not what should be given to each individual client if I want to know my true numbers on a day-to-day basis and not just once a month. So
Mhm.
obviously when you get big enough, you have to hire a CFO. You can't hire a bookkeeper for a $5 million a year company. You need an in-house employee. And that's a whole different topic, but I actually am really big about hiring VAs now. I've been doing a lot of work with that recently, and I have a full-time VA that works for my company. And there's actually pretty easily ways to get a VA that can do accounting and bookkeeping. Whole different topic, whole different conversation we can touch on later.
Can you
But
explain for our audience what VA stands
so,
for?
so VA is a virtual assistant. So I actually have a full-time VA, 40 hours a week. And they're actually in the Philippines. And it's very, very normal over there to work for American companies and to have virtual jobs. So a huge percentage of the population in a lot of countries around the world actually work online and from home. So I have a full-time virtual assistant that all they do is work for me. And they do a lot of our customer data entry, customer data input. They answer our phones, answer our emails, and I'm working on training them to do a lot of our back-end administrative work. And it helps us stay on top of everything. And it's a lot more affordable than hiring a full-time employee in the States. I'm a big fan of hiring people in the US, obviously, but when I can hire somebody in the US for $80,000 a year or hire a VA for $30,000 a year, and based on cost of living, they're actually making the same amount of money, it's hard to argue as a business of paying 5 times the amount of money for the same amount of work.
That's good.
And
I think
for the audience, just so everybody knows, the average minimum wage in the Philippines is $1 or $2 an hour.
wow.
So you can pay somebody there $3, $4, $5, $6 an hour, and they are ecstatic. That
They're
is
rich.
they're
Yeah.
rich by the Philippine
Yeah.
standards.
Hmm.
To give you some context, like eating out at a restaurant for a family of 5 costs $10. Monthly rent on an apartment in Manila is $200 a month. You can live a very, very happy life with a lot of amenities, travel, vacation, things like that for under $1,000 a month. So paying somebody what feels like very little in the US is actually paying somebody there a lot. And you can get a college educated person with 10 years of experience for $5 or $6 an hour that does
Wow.
phenomenal work, speaks fluent English, and will be ecstatic about having a job with a US based company. It's a very big thing over there in the culture there to work for US based companies because they know that it's a way to make more money and have a better life and better ability to provide for their families.
That's awesome, man. I think that my biggest takeaway from what you're sharing here is something that we talked about on our last coaching call with the Handyman Academy is just tracking everything and the importance of tracking. I think that's something that a
Yeah.
lot of people don't do is they go into they start this business and they're like, well, at my last job I made 35 bucks an hour. So I'm going to start charging 50 bucks an hour. And that should be good, right? And that's how I started pricing and figuring out all this stuff. And once you actually start tracking and figuring out what your expenses are and like keeping an eye on that, it grows pretty drastically where you realize that 50 bucks an hour that you're charging is really very minimal. So what I always recommend to people is like print out the last 3 months of bank statements and get a bunch of highlighters and start highlighting all of your expenses and then create a spreadsheet that documents every single thing because I think that's some serious stuff. And if you don't document your expenses, they're going to get away from you very quickly. And I think you're going to lose your company and worse, you're going to lose your own, personal finances. I think that's been my biggest takeaway from what you've been sharing. And I really appreciate that. I think that's awesome. And I think it's a dire warning to really all of us to make sure that we are on top of our expenses and know what that is and how much we need to charge each month to make things happen.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
as far as, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Oh no, you're good. I was going to go on another tangent. Feel free to go to a follow-up question.
Yeah, so I was just gonna get back to like any other takeaways that come to mind because so far we've got like your relationship with debt. So just be careful and honest about your debt. Your labor, checks and balances, processes, so you can find when people are doing donuts in the parking lot in a branded truck and doing so drunk. Knowing your numbers. Like what other, and I think overall there's also this there's this this wisdom of having patience when you're growing and having honesty in your finances and what you're taking on. But what else comes to mind, man, as far as like the experience that you've been through with Pacific Outdoor Living? It's just such an incredible learning experience, man. I know a lot of pain in that. And just like, what else comes to mind as far as things that you wish someone told you or things you would have done differently and are now applying in Northwest Moss?
So I think the biggest thing from the last 5 years that I could summarize up into one cohesive statement is the last 5 years and dealing with the amount of money I've dealt with, the amount of debt I've dealt with, the business growing and then failing and then growing a new company again is that if you asked a lot of business owners that have been in business for a while, what is the most valuable thing to them? They'll tell you it's time. And I think that what the biggest thing that's changed for me and the biggest takeaway I have from all of this is that I have changed my perspective on what it actually is that success looks like. Because I used to be that guy who was like, I want the nice house, the nice car, the whatever. And I used to like my favorite example of this is I make a vision board every 6 months to a year, and I put it on the wall in my office. And a few years ago, that vision board used to have fancy cars, fancy trucks, fancy houses, stacks of cash that were on fire, like the whole like typical entrepreneur, like I don't know what the right term for it is, but like you go on Instagram and you scroll through entrepreneur posts and it's all about like being flashy. And I think part of it is the experience I've had in my business the last 5 years, but I think also the other part of it is getting married and having a son and being more involved with my family every day has taught me that the most valuable thing that you have as a business owner is your ability to have more time. And if I could make 200 grand a year, but only work 10 hours a week, I would choose that in a heartbeat over working 60 hours a week, but making $1 million a year.
Mm-hmm.
Now, does that mean I don't want to make $1 million a year? Obviously not. I'd love to make as much money as I can in my business in the long term and grow my company. But what I think I've changed is that when it comes down to making decisions in my company, I make decisions more based on what does this give me as far as freedom of time, freedom of ability to be flexible, freedom of the ability to make decisions in my company that give me back my time, not just make me more money. And a lot of that I think ties back into the debt thing that you were talking about of like, do you really need that fancy new truck, or is it just you proving to yourself that you're successful? Do you really need the big fancy office, or is it just because you want to feel like your company is at a point where it needs an office? Um, like I operate my new company with as many employees as I have out of my house. I don't need a big fancy office or shop. I have a 500 square foot shop in my backyard that is a portable building, shed style building that I bought when I bought this house. And I have storage on the side of the house for chemicals and equipment. I got my beat up old fishing boat parked next to the house, and I got no other things that I need besides my office in the house and my shop in the backyard. I don't need a big storefront. I don't need a billboard. I don't need 43 brand new trucks that have the logos on the side of them. I really just want to build a company that allows me and my family to have time to take a 2 week vacation and not have to have my phone ringing the whole time I'm on vacation.
Yeah.
And I
Man,
think every
that's
business owner can
awesome.
relate to that.
Yeah, and it's goes against the grain because yeah, the entrepreneurship culture. We talked about this in actually in an upcoming episode here, or well, I guess previous episode by the time this one
Yeah.
releases. Um, but it goes against the grain of entrepreneurship culture, which I always use this phrase of glorification of the grind. Entrepreneurship culture has a way of glorifying the grind, of working 68 hours a week, the hustle, when in reality, at our core as humans, like we want freedom of time and freedom of
Mhm.
finance. And um,
Yeah.
scaling and working 80 hours a week, taking on tons of overhead and debt is not conducive to that. But it
Nope.
takes a lot of courage and sometimes a lot of pain to kind of get real with what am I doing in my business to create freedom of time and freedom of finance. Also, a big one personally for me is how can I reduce my stress as an owner? How
Mhm.
can I reduce my required labor hours that the owner of the company has to be involved with the operations?
Yep.
All these things, the culture of entrepreneurism uh, in a lot of ways goes against the most important things that we need to focus on, and being content with what we have and being honest with, I'm happy with what I've got right now. And I would take more, but I'm happy.
Yeah. And that's kind of where I'm at too, of like I look at all these different opportunities and all these different options for what I want to do, and I see it through a lens more of what does this get me as far as time with my family, time at home, time away from the office. Like is adding this extra expense to my company going to give me more time? And am I just going to use that time for other things in the business, or is it actually going to give me time off? I look at a lot of the things in my business through a lens of freedom as compared to money.
Mhm. Yeah. So, and for our listeners too, Chris, like it was like a year ago about you got married. You've had a baby in the last year. Is that right?
Hmm.
It's
Yeah,
roughly within a year.
yep, yeah. I met my wife a year and a half ago, and we had our baby in December. Don't think about the timeline too hard. Don't do the math. Um, and we have a 9 month old, sorry, 10 month old son, Jackson. And then I have two stepdaughters that are 3 and 5. So I kind of overnight, it feels like, have a full house and a whole family. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I commend your strength and courage, man, to go through like the bankruptcy and the trials of Pacific Outdoor Living. And we had plenty of conversations. Like, I feel grateful to know you from this one of the early in your journey as Pacific maintenance. But I just commend you, man, for everything that you've gone through with like honesty and integrity and just being real with, like, when you talk about my employees were doing donuts in the parking lot, that's my fault. Like owning that, but getting married, having a baby, new kids, like, dude, like, you're just so composed, and just have a lot of wisdom. And so I just commend you for that, man. You've just done a great job, and really appreciate you sharing like this story as well with Pacific Outdoor Living. Um, all that being said, to kind of transition here, I do have to wind down within 5 minutes. Okay, you got Northwest moss removal. We don't have time to get into the details. Probably a future episode.
Yeah.
We have a good time with you, man, because there's a lot of layover with the handyman business, and certainly the efficiency you're building in with the subscription-based kind of model. I know you're just starting like a podcast yourself, and like what's kind of next for you? You're out of the Pacific Outdoor Living, Northwest moss removal. What's next for Chris Olson?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, for those of you listening that don't know me personally, I'm also a full-time firefighter paramedic still for the fire department. So I have a full-time gig where I am a union firefighter paramedic for a small fire department. And I'm testing for a lieutenant's promotion potentially in the next few months. So I'm studying hard for that. Northwest moss removal is growing, and my goal is to get it to 3 crews by spring. I have 2.5 kind of right now. And I'm just building the foundation and building the systems for Northwest moss removal to grow and thrive. So it comes back to that building a house on sand versus building a house on concrete kind of thing. Pacific Outdoor Living was built on a rocky foundation, and Northwest Moss, I'm trying to build out all of the systems, all the procedures, all the guidelines, all the foundation to help it grow efficiently. And that's mostly what I'm working on right now. I'm also in the middle of remodeling my house because I bought a fixer-upper house thinking that was a good idea. So that's a lot of my weekends and evenings. Fortunately, I know a guy. That's a joke, but um, I keep myself pretty busy with that. And otherwise, it's just growing and systematizing the business and working at the fire department and spending time with my family and hopefully getting my fishing boat running. So next season, I actually get to go out. This season, the boat sat on the trailer the whole season.
Understandable.
Understandable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Things are crazy. So what kind of parting advice would you have to prospective new handyman business owners? Like, what kind of advice would you have for people that are like just looking to get started in this, or maybe they're in the spot where you kind of were too? Like, what kind of advice would you have?
Yeah. So for people just getting started, my biggest piece of advice is treat your business like a business, not like a job. So before you hire your first employee, before you get an office person, before you grow, take all the things that you do every day, put them on paper, and build the systems, policies, and procedures as if you have all the employees. When you're a single man show handyman running around like I was in my pickup truck years ago, you are the salesman, you're the estimator, you're the office manager, you're the lead technician in the field, and you're the apprentice because you're doing all the grunt work at the same time. And at the end of the day, you have to sit down and, before you hire somebody to fill one of those positions, write down their job description, write down what they're doing every day, put all of your procedures and what you do every day on paper so that when you go to fill one of those roles, you actually know what you're going to have that person do. Before you grow, build that foundation. And if you're a bigger company that's struggling, my biggest advice is to find a good coach and find a good attorney and find a good bookkeeper and talk to all of them about your position so that you know whether you're going in the right direction or not. And even if you don't think you're in a bad spot, but if you're in that position where you're not struggling, but you're not making enough money or you're not making as much money as you'd like to, same advice applies. find somebody that knows what they're doing and have them help you get to a spot where you know what's happening and what's happening is not what you want it to be.
Love it. Love it, man. I think my biggest takeaway from all of this is, you know, as men, as business owners, we're not defined by who we are when stuff goes well, but we're defined by who we are and the choices that we make when things go wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that that you've exemplified that, Chris, and I appreciate you coming back on. I want to put a challenge out there to the listeners. You know, Chris was the number 3 episode of this podcast 3 years ago with Pacific Home Maintenance. Go back, watch that video. Right now, that video is ranked number 3. So if we could get that thing ranked to number 1, that means that people listened to this podcast and went back and gave him some support. So that would be super cool just to see the example from that. And Chris, you're a great example of, you know, what do you do when things go wrong? How do you rebuild? How do you continue? Because I think that, like, if you make, like, failure is part of the process. You know, I'm part of this men's workout group called F3, and they have this thing called the leadership development process. And the way that it works is you have schooling, apprenticeship, opportunity, and failure. And that's the process that you go through to become a leader. Failure is the 4th part of that. Like, we all have to fail. Failure is part of the gig, and it's how we pivot from that failure is what decides if we're going to have success or not. So I think that's really awesome. Just want to commend you for that, and really appreciate you being back on here, man. We'll have to have you on again to talk about your new company. But I think
Absolutely.
there's been a lot of good info here. So yeah, thanks a lot, Chris,
Awesome.
and we appreciate you, man.
Yeah, appreciate you guys a lot. Thanks for having me on again. And if anybody wants to connect with me, feel free to find me on social media, and I'm happy to talk with folks.
You're the man, Chris. And just yeah, I commend you for just sharing your heart and being honest about, most people just keep all this in, you know, feeling like a failure. But dude, I have no doubt, like, we'll have you back on for Northwest Moss, but I have no doubt years down the road, hopefully we're still doing this podcast, Alan, and Chris will be like a multi-bazooka millionaire. He'll have it all figured out. He'll have that story of bankruptcy. So I have no doubt, Chris, like, dude, you're just such an upstanding character. You're on the right path. And thank you so much for opening your heart and being honest and sharing your experience that most people would probably keep in. So we just appreciate you doing that.
Absolutely. Hopefully somebody else learns from it and doesn't end up in the same situation, or ends up in the same situation, but keeps their head up a little bit higher.
Yeah. You probably prevented like 17 bankruptcies. So wow.
Yeah,
amazing.
for sure. Yeah,
Awesome.
There you go.
I can only hope so.
Our most productive episode ever.
All right, friends, that's a wrap of this episode of the Handyman Success Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us on your journey in building a thriving handyman business. We would love to hear your thoughts on this episode. Whether you learned something new or you're facing challenges that you're just not quite sure how to deal with, we would absolutely love to hear from you. We would love it if you would leave us a review, drop us a comment, or hit that like button telling us that you liked this episode. By doing this, you truly help and support us in creating more of these podcast episodes to help change the handyman industry to something amazing. And I want you to remember that you are not alone on this journey. Jason and I are here to help. If you need anything at all in regards to business or marketing, you can reach out to either Jason or I at handymansuccess.net. You can go over there right now and set up a free consultation call with either of us. We would absolutely love to talk with you. So thanks again for spending this time with us, and until next time, go out and be a blessing.